Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am, of course, Josh Beiser, and we have a great cast for you. For this week, we're going to be talking to the CEO of Mode 7. They have been around for quite a long time, developing and publishing games, including the hit Frozen Synapse. They're currently working with a developer, Ground Shatter, on the upcoming game Frights in Tight Spaces. And the CEO is on with me today to discuss the studio, game development, and for a design topic, the challenges and kind of considerations when you're trying to keep somebody playing or otherwise long-term retention. So please welcome to the podcast, Paul Taylor.
Hi, Josh. It's really nice to be here.
Yep, it's great. Yep, it's great to have you on, Paul. We've been talking about doing this for a while, and with everybody now, I guess, forced to be stuck inside, we certainly have plenty of time to do these things.
Yeah, you got me.
But it is a pleasure to have you on. Not counting the whole virus thing, how are things going otherwise for you?
Kind of difficult to not count that. Yeah, no, things are good actually, especially work-wise. So we announced, as you mentioned in your intro, Frights in Tight Spaces earlier in the week, which every day feels like about a month at the moment, but it was actually earlier this week. And thanks to the amazing games media, to my friends in the game development community, and to people who've played our games, that announcement went well. People were sharing it a lot. We got a lot of love and encouragement, and people just really like the idea of the game. So to get that positive wave from that, something that the developers have been working on for a while, and I've been involved on the publishing side for a while, that really kind of reminds you why you do this stuff. So that's been a big positive uplift for, a really challenging week.
Yep, and congratulations on that. And I know what you feel about time being all messed up. As somebody who has been working from home normally, my whole sense of time has been screwed up. But with this whole thing going on now, it just feels like, what year is it at this point for day to day?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a strange time, but just seeing, people still enjoying games and kind of enjoying the news about games. I think one theme that came out was people were saying, thank you for doing something that's just fun, putting some fun into our timelines on social media and into the world, and something else to think about, really. So that was again quite validating, because I think at times like this you can think, games maybe aren't the most important thing in the world, but they have their role, and that's an important one.
Oh, definitely. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more discussions about in the coming weeks and months. I know I just heard that I think they're rescheduling GDC for the summertime, or at least tentatively for right now.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I mean, personally, I have to say I think that's very ambitious. So we'll just have to see. I mean, it's caused absolute havoc for events generally of all kinds, venues of all kinds. So I think everyone has to be reactive. That's the only thing we can do. It's difficult to plan, and my heart really goes out to the GDC organizers. They try really hard. It's a huge operation, and having to have it derailed like this is very difficult. But all credit to them for trying.
Yep, and I know, trying to, keep with our, in theme with our topics for tonight, I know it's been incredibly rough for indie developers. As you said earlier, with trying to get the word out about Frights in Tight Spaces, that I know a lot of developers who have been really dreading this news about whole GDC cancellation, because a lot of them were going out there to do marketing and promotional work. And for the developers who watch my show, these things, or these times, can be very crucial, especially for smaller and up-and-coming teams.
Yes, absolutely. We had some stuff lined up at GDC that we had to pull out of, and so on. So I think when it's something like this, though, as I mentioned, everyone's having to adapt. And something I've found really encouraging in the last week or so has just been how much everyone's getting done remotely. I mean, we're so lucky to be in an industry that's based on digital infrastructure, and to have that infrastructure hold up in the context of a sort of world-changing event like this. So there's two very big pieces of luck there, but people are really sort of making the most of it. So, I mean, I would say as well to perhaps other developers or up-and-coming developers who've been hit by this, a conference not happening, it's not the end of the world. You can still reach out to people. People are very keen to help. People are very keen to share contacts and information and so on. That's one of the best things about the games industry as a whole, is that in the most part, people want to see other people succeed.
Yes.
And they feel that success brings everyone up. And that's certainly still true in the indie game scene, which has changed a massive amount since I've been involved with it. But there's still a spirit of that there, and it's just not present in other industries or other fields. So that's something that you can always rely on. And I would just say to people, have some faith in that. Reach out to people that you do know, and don't be afraid of contacting people that you don't know, because it's a very open industry.
Yes, and like for myself, I do a monthly indie spotlight streams where I just look at nothing but indie games, and
Awesome.
like I play everything. Like I don't care if you are a one-person team or this is a game that you just started 2 minutes ago. Like I've played all manner of games, and like you said, the people in this industry want to see other developers succeed. Like nobody wants to see a studio go under, and that's always been one of the best parts about it.
Yeah.
Now, with that said, we certainly have a lot to discuss here for tonight. So, to begin with, Paul, since this is your first time on the cast, for people who don't know who you are, could you talk a little bit about your background and kind of what you've done in game dev?
Sure. So I've been working in games for about 15 years, and I helped to start a development studio called Mode 7 with my very good friend Ian Hardingham, and we started off sort of, he was still in university, or sorry, I was still in university and he had just left, and we started working initially, this was sort of around 2005, although we had done some work together previous to that. We worked on our first game, which was a flying multiplayer sword fighting game called Determinants, which is pretty unique for its time. It had this sort of analog mouse-based sword control, but it wasn't really a very good game. That then led us to quite a long period of doing various types of contract work, porting, work on graphics for TV quiz shows was one of the things we did. And that time sort of was us trying to figure out how to make games and how to do something that would, do a bit better in the marketplace and gain a bit of a following. So that time was spent coming up with Frozen Synapse, and we launched an open beta for that in 2010. So that was quite pioneering at the time. We sort of had a pre-order, gets you the beta type system, and that came out in 2011. And it changed our lives. It did really well. We got on Steam, which at that time was very difficult. Valve had to sort of personally ask you to put a game on the platform, as absurd as that seems now. You actually got an email from someone at Valve saying, "Hey, have you considered Steam distribution?" One of the greatest emails I've ever received. That was from Anna Sweet at Valve, sent me that mail, and we were overjoyed to get that. So that combination of being on there early with a game that kind of really resonated with people was great for us. And then we followed that up with two other quite similar games, Frozen Cortex, which was a sort of futuristic sports game. It was also a kind of simultaneous turn-based strategy game, and Frozen Synapse 2, the sequel to the original, which added this kind of big strategic layer. And then sort of around 2016, 2017, we decided to start publishing titles from other developers. Signed a game called Tokyo 42, which did well, kind of an isometric, sort of stylish action game, kind of a bit classic GTA meets Syndicate in a colorful world. And then followed that up with a lovely, charming city builder title called The Colonists, which is continuing to do really well on Steam, actually. Not sort of Prison Architect levels of really well or anything like that, but really, really good for an indie game just made by one person. In fact, mostly that game with some support from other freelancers and so on. So we've made small scale games. Our company's never been sort of larger than really 5 people in house, I think was our largest. And we're back down to currently just me with some other freelancers, mostly focusing on the publishing side right now. But I do have another development project which I I guess announced. I mean, I started talking about it on Twitter, so that counts as an announcement, right? So I'm working on another development project currently, which is a space combat game, and publishing Frights in Tight Spaces. So that's what I'm currently doing.
Great. And as you said, you've been in the game industry or doing game dev for about 15 years now. And
Yeah.
it is, again, like we said a few minutes ago about how much time seems to have no meaning these days. 15 years, for some people, sounds like it could be just 100 years in terms of just how far things have come. And what you said earlier about how back in the old days when, Steam had to contact you to get onto the platform, right. I'm sure there are some indie devs right now listening to this, thinking that sounds like some far distant past. That must have been 30 years ago when they did that.
It's so weird. I mean, so I went to an event and Mark Healy was there, who's the co-founder of Media Molecule, and he was doing a talk about his game Ragdoll Kung Fu, which came out in 2008. You know Ragdoll Kung Fu. I know this because I think we talked about it before. But a lot of people now won't know this game, and that was, I believe, the first indie game on Steam. I think Darwinia came quite soon afterwards in 2008, but that was the first indie game on Steam. And it's just to look at that game and kind of how that happened. They flew Mark out personally to Seattle and said oh, we're trying to do this thing, and and he had got a contact there through I believe a lawyer that worked at Valve, and he sort of very kindly shared that information with me and said maybe you could talk to them. And so that the kind of constituent elements of indie games, Steam was really not designed to be this vast kind of content platform for everyone at that point. It was really for Valve initially, and then for other publishers to release, large publishers to release things digitally. And then over time, because Valve is such a progressive company, they're always looking to the future. They're always looking to create platforms and systems. Such a system-driven company. They decided to kind of broaden it out. And then there was the second wave of Steam with Greenlight that came in, I believe 2015.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
2014, 2015, and that was the start of the great floodgates opening as we see it now. I mean, something that I found interesting is that people have kind of heralded the death of Steam or the death of indie games, or at all these different points. I was sort of in the room when Greenlight was announced in the UK, and the mood among developers at that event was kind of oh no, here come the masses. But actually, every turn that's kind of, I think, had a positive effect. It's not so simple as people say, oh, if you made an indie game in 2009, free money. Well, I know plenty of people who made indie games in 2009 and didn't make any money. So the whole history of that is a complex one, and things change over time, but they don't necessarily get immediately dramatically better or worse.
I remember back in 2004 when I think Steam first came on, and nobody thought that platform was going to do anything. This whole idea of attaching your game to another client, and so many people, including myself, were just horribly wrong with that one.
Yes, no, I remember the same thing. I mean, Ian and who I started the company with, we got our copy of Half-Life 2, and we were kind of installing it at his house, and we were like, what's this thing that we have to do now? It's some weird copy protection thing. And we thought, this is terrible. Who's gonna use this? And so it's so funny. But that's what happens when you talk to people from Valve, they really have their brains sort of fixed on the future. And I think a lot of that, comes from Gabe Newell and his attitude, and other senior people at Valve, of course. But they're really looking forwards a lot of the time. And I think that affects a lot of their decision making. It's why some of their decision making can be quite opaque and at times, and I think Valve have done a lot recently to kind of open that back up again, and make sure that their relationship with developers is good, and that people are clear on things. They have a lot of responsibility in terms of kind of being largely responsible for digital distribution on PC, but I think they handle it very well overall.
Yep, and again, with how much things have changed in terms of the market, I mean, there's probably 2 or 3 podcasts just on that one topic alone. And one thing that I wanted to touch on with you is the idea of going from being just a developer to a publisher. I know I've spoken with Cliff Harris a few times from Positech about this.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess for you and your partner with Mode 7, what led you into doing indie publishing as well as designing?
It was a combination of factors, really. But one thing, we were spending a lot of time making games. We were quite slow at game development through various points in our history, and we were sort of looking at how can we be more productive, because that's something that you often have to do to respond to kind of a more challenging market, which is busier, as you have to look at yourself and go, how can we improve our productivity? And one of the things that we thought we could do is use some of the functions that weren't being used at sort of mid-development, like my ability to do PR and marketing for one thing, and just sort of those resources that we had to work with other developers, particularly newer developers who might not have that experience, and people who might be overlooked by larger publishers, or sort of might need some guidance on how to do a game at a small scale. There are plenty of publishers out there, especially now. I mean, the increase in that has been very rapid as well, but there aren't that many with extensive development experience, going back years, kind of built in. So that was the thing that we felt we could offer that was pretty unique, was just that knowledge of how to deliver something that's really high quality, knowledge, of the challenges. We've had things go well, we've had things go badly, different reasons for both of those. We've been through a lot. So at that point, we sort of said, like, how can we make use of that and give value to other people and sort of expand our business, really. And we were just lucky enough to find some great developers to work with, and people to whom we could genuinely add that value. I think that's something, if you're making an investment in something or getting involved in any kind of project, you want to feel like you're making a significant contribution that's going to affect the outcome. And we, in terms of publishing, we'll always take on things that where that's true. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I remember when I spoke with Cliff about this, and one of the things that he said was that after developing so many games for so many years, like, he kind of understood, like, that whole process of what it means to publish and market your game, and felt like he could help and assist other developers, because it is a very hard point about game development. It's something that for a lot of our live shows and recorded videos, we've talked about at length, that there are developers out there who have a lot of trouble when it comes to marketing their game. And in today's world, that can be more than half the battle in terms of getting people to notice you.
Right, absolutely. And I always think that one of the good things about games is that they really exemplify the truism, marketing starts with the product. Marketing isn't a thing that you bolt on to something that already exists. It should inform the decisions you're making as a developer, because marketing is about connecting with people. There's a lot of people hear the word marketing and they think of, like, Ty Lopez on YouTube telling you about his Lamborghini or something. They think about that, and there is that side to it. But the sort of real nature of it should be about, here's something that is going to have a positive impact on someone else. How can I tell them about it, and how can I get them to engage with it? And you can't get people to engage if that really isn't true, if you're not making something that has those fundamental qualities to it. And that's why, I enjoy game marketing, but I really only enjoy it when it's something that I believe in, that I'm passionate about, that I just want to go, hey, try this thing. So I think that's kind of something that is challenging for a lot of developers, because learning to come up with concepts that resonate with people and executing those concepts in such a way that they're accessible, and that they're not sort of hampered by problems, that's a lifelong skill. Experienced developers still get that wrong. Look at some of the big names that have had games fail. Nobody is immune to making mistakes in that area. So it's just very difficult. But over time, you do pick up some understanding of different audiences and what they might want and how they look at games. And that can really inform, what you're making and the way you make it.
And yeah, like you said, like, for a lot of people out there, both in the industry and out, they look at marketing sometimes as being, this evil thing, quote unquote, you are selling out if you try and like mention your game on Twitter or you try and do like marketing with somebody else. And it is very much something that, like, as a developer, you need to be able to show that passion about your game, because if you don't care about your game, nobody else is really going to do it for you.
Right. I think it's being exposed to a lot of bad stuff. Like, I think a lot of, sales and marketing that we experience in our daily lives, it is bad and it isn't predicated on real things. But to me, the people that are worried about overdoing it, or they're concerned for other people's time and attention, those are the people that I want to hear more from, like, because they're good and intelligent and sensitive people. They're not in your face shouting all the time. So unfortunately, the only way to get people to notice you is to compete in that environment a bit. And it's something I struggle with. It's something that everyone struggles with. When am I competing and when am I just making the situation worse by adding to the noise? But I think if you're sensitive and intelligent about what you're saying, how you're saying it, the kind of people you're saying it to, one person's noise is another person's music. So it's kind of, if you're talking to the right audience, then they're going to like what you're saying, and then they are going to be interested in it. If you're blasting it at everyone willy-nilly, then a lot of people are going to be annoyed with you. So I really think that if developers are making something that they believe in, or any creative person's making something that they believe in, having that connection with other people is what that's all about. There's still this myth of kind of, if you make amazing art, then people will come, and there's some truth in that, but it's a very slippery truth that's sort of difficult to articulate, and it's not as clear cut as people think. You can make the most beautiful thing in the world, and if no one ever sees it, then it's just going to be for you, and that might be okay. But if your goal is to reach an audience or make money or any combination of those two things, you got to present it to people in some way.
Yeah. And like you said, for a lot of people, especially developers, they're not interested. Oh, there's a car alarm going off. Sorry about that. Okay, 1 second. All right, 3, 2, 1. Yep, and as you said, for a lot of developers out there, they're not thinking about, what is the most clickbaity way I can present myself on Twitter or make the most exciting thumbnail on YouTube. They're just trying to make a video game. And one thing that I felt from a lot of developers I've spoken to with these casts is that to them, this isn't like being a celebrity. Like, just because you make a video game, you're not, a triple A or, you're A-list celebrity. You're just doing your job day to day. And it's kind of weird and awkward to kind of like present yourself as this big hotshot when it's just like your normal 9 to 5 or whatever.
Well, I think, again, it's sort of, who do you want to hear from? Do you want to hear from the person that thinks they're a hotshot and thinks they're amazing? Or do you want to hear from someone who's humble about the work they do, who cares about it, who, is putting real passion into it to try and make something good? Like, I want to hear from that person. But in order to hear from them, they have to talk, and they have to have a vehicle by which they're presenting stuff to other people. It's a battle that I've had, with different friends and different people sort of absolutely throughout my life. And I think we've got to a point now where most people recognize that you kind of have to, in quotes, do marketing, but they sort of don't necessarily always understand what that is or how to do it or how communities work. And I would just say, it's about finding things that are good, that really do help people and bring them together. I mean, something that we've started doing recently in conjunction with the team at Ground Shatter is to run a Discord server for Frights in Tight Spaces. And on that Discord server, we're doing metagame style stuff in the style of, Mike Rose from No More Robots, who's kind of made that approach famous. And you can look at that on the one hand, you can say like, oh, why are people playing these silly games? We have kind of bots in there that people can play games with and so on. And then you go in there, especially at the moment, and you see people playing it, and they're all discussing like, what's the right strategy for this bot and what's going to happen in the story for the metagame and who's this person and how much money do you have and what. So it's really, once you see that kind of people just enjoying themselves in a community space that you're curating, who could argue that that's a bad thing? So there's that aspect to it as well. When you're building communities around something, which is the modern way of doing marketing, is to build a community that has innate value, irrespective of whether people buy the game or whatever. You're doing something there that's good, and I'd really urge developers to sort of think about that. Don't think about it as selling to people. Like, people are very savvy about being sold to now. They know when a hard sell is coming. But instead, if you're there directly benefiting them and they have a relationship with you and your game, then the money will kind of emerge out of that eventually.
Yep. And Paul, if you want to do some more, help me with marketing tips, I would really appreciate it with Game Wiz was. I could use some of that insight.
Sure thing. Well, my consultancy fees are very reasonable.
All right, great. So before we talk more about your games and get to our main design topic, one final question for you regarding doing like indie publishing. And this is something that I like to ask a lot of developers who have gone that route themselves. When you look at kind of the games where you talk to developers who they're interested in working with you, what do you think, or are there any like notable red flags that you feel are common for indie devs to make when it comes to the marketing or publishing side of their game?
So red flags in terms of, would I say no to taking on their game? Do you mean in that kind of context, or just things that people aren't doing well?
Let's actually do both, because I think they're both very big or very important for developers listening.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, there's sort of different types of red flag. I mean, there's not reading some basic information on a contact form is actually the main red flag that I see when I receive kind of cold pitches. So, on our site, it has a description of the kind of games that we're interested in. It's kind of, it's not a very prescriptive description, but it is there. And it's clear that a lot of people sending pitches to that are just trying to find the contact form as fast as possible, pasting in the same information they've pasted into 100 people and pressing send. Like, that is never going to get your game signed. None of those games will ever be signed by any publishers at all, because if you're not capable of thinking about why you are submitting something to that publisher, thinking about their output, how you fit in with their catalog, or making something that stands out enough to kind of cut through that crowd of people doing the same things, then you will not find a publisher. Things that have gone further down the line, I think a big red flag for me is people who keep restarting development. That's a really difficult issue, because especially if they haven't finished a game before, one of the main risk you're taking on as a publisher is development risk. And that category basically means, will the game get finished in a viable form, and will it be like an acceptable functional product, at least when it comes out? If you can release a game that works, then the risk goes down dramatically. From no game being released, or a game that fundamentally doesn't work. So that is a real concern, and that can kind of come out of due diligence and talking to people when you sort of realize that a project might have had a difficult history. I have looked at some projects that have been like that, and kind of that seemed like something that could be pushed past if the developer had the right guidance. So it's not like an absolute problem, but one of the things that is always reassuring to a publisher is that you finished something. Even better if you finished something that had some degree of success. Doesn't have to be a huge hit or anything like that, but something that got out in the market and people liked. So those are kind of big publishing sort of red flags on the front end. Things that people do wrong generally, I think planning and scope is a huge one.
Yes.
Projects I've been involved with, it's the same thing that everyone says, really. It's over-scoping and not focusing on the core of the game first, getting something that's fun in a prototype that really is a meaningful game design that you can imagine someone playing for a long time, that doesn't sort of get boring or dull after about 20 minutes, is that something that developers still need to do this. People who push on really far with art and polish and secondary systems and stuff before they have that core game loop in there. Yeah. Core game loops are hard.
Yes.
They're hard. I found this out sort of for myself. I did a free text-based game called War Dialer, which is a sort of hacking adventure game, and it's reasonably significant in terms of its scope. It's quite a long game for that sort of game. But I allowed myself to kind of approach that as a hobby project, and I found that I was doing all the things that I tell people not to do. I was building out content before I had a core loop. I was, and it's just everyone needs to remember that lesson of, you're making a game and the gameplay of the game needs to be good.
Yes.
It seems so straightforward, but it's so hard to get right. It's like saying, just draw a good picture. It's along those lines. So drawing a good picture takes years of practice and training and working on individual bits and focus on sketching that object or working from your imagination. And games are no different. So focusing on the basics is something that everyone has to remember to do.
Mm-hmm. And especially with the idea of the core gameplay loop. This is something that I've been talking more and more about with a lot of the content with Game Wisdom, is this idea that you have to understand the fundamental level what your game is going to be about. Because it doesn't matter how many secondary systems or what your aesthetics are, if at the end of the day, it's all connected to nothing. Or it's something that just doesn't end up working. And I've seen developers, sadly, who've had that very issue of chasing that core gameplay loop. And I'm sure you've seen this as well, that, it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back in terms of progress. And either A, the game never gets done, or B, they finally figure it out, but it's too late, and now there's no money or, anything left in the budget to actually make this game now.
It's difficult, and it is something that people say a lot. I mean, I think it's interesting to kind of think about ways of circumventing that. So how do you do it right? And I think that comes from allowing yourself to fail a lot at the beginning. I think there's a lot of sort of maybe some of the ways that game design has been taught in the past has been, you do a paper prototype and then you write a document and then all of that stuff is good. Doing paper prototypes, writing documents. I wrote a design document for the space combat game that we're going to be working on soon, and which was just quite long. It had there was quite a lot of different stuff in the document, suggestions of secondary systems and so on, but it was all there ready to be thrown away. We're exploring different things, and there's ideas in there that we can go to that document and grab them and go, let's try this. Whether it survives or not doesn't matter. And the thing we're building out first is, here is, the 3D model of the cockpit that you're in, and here's how the controls work, and here's how you shoot lasers. And we're starting with that. We're making that feel good first, because it's the major action that the player does in the game, is move the ship around in 3D space and fire lasers at things. And then once that's good, we're going to move on to, does it feel good to shoot a static target? Does it feel good to shoot a moving target? Does it feel good to shoot a target moving in a pattern? And then finally, what's some very basic AI for an enemy, and how is that going to feel? And you can't get the entire game design from your head into the computer instantaneously. You have to do things like that, step through, see how it feels at different times. Game design is such a combination of intuition and analysis that you've got to let yourself try things and fail. And it's best to do that, without secondary stuff hanging on it, without art hanging on it. Just a pure, working on that prototype until it feels good with no art or with very limited art. And then you're on the right track.
Yep.
But a lot of people don't have that luxury of time, especially if they're going out pitching, they want to get the art in quickly and so on. So it's difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And like you said, just getting that basic structure down, it sounds simple. Again, it's one of those things that sounds so simple and to tell somebody, but it is very hard to just know whether or not this idea is going to appeal to people other than yourself.
Yes.
And that is pretty much half the battle at the start. And like I've said this before to on a lot of my shows, that these days I can spot almost very quickly whether or not a game has the quote-unquote magical it, in terms of, a really solid core gameplay loop. And like we've always said, it sounds simple. Like when I talk about this and I make my videos, I say that the stuff that we're talking about, most people will never think about, because when it works, it looks like you did nothing at all. But again, the simplest stuff is oftentimes the most complicated to get right.
Yeah. And that's why I think people can be very unforgiving of themselves, especially if they're new game design and they kind of think, I should be able to do all this straight away. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing, that I've picked up sort of working on games and kind of taking now into my role, being more of a lead designer on projects or kind of working directly with lead designers, it's that you have to be kind to yourself, and just, if you make something that's bad, that's great information. Mm-hmm. That thing doesn't work. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So throw it away and then move on to something else. And you're right, it's very hard. You're relying on your own judgment a lot, and that's why it's good to have other people that you trust around or other team members, when you get to that point. But a lot of the time it's about having your best go at something, finding a direction, sticking with it, working out some problems yourself and going, I think this is solid, and then taking it externally for feedback. I think some people seek out feedback way too early, and some people don't seek it out at all. Yeah. And there's a happy medium there in terms of, you have to get confident with an idea. And it's practice. That's why it sounds simple, but it isn't. I know what I have to do to exercise. Like, I know exactly, have an exercise bike in my house. Like, I know exactly how long I have to spend on that bike every day to maintain my fitness. And I don't do it every day because it's hard work. And sometimes I'm tired and I don't feel like not persistent enough to do it, right? And any skill is the same. Game design is the same. Music is the same. It's about sitting down, focusing your mind, putting the time in, and not judging yourself when it doesn't work. And that's just difficult. Games are hard because there's so many moving pieces and so much is contingent on so much else that it can be difficult to do. But I'd massively encourage anyone trying to get into game design or who's in game design and struggling with it to just allow yourself the time is the main thing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And again, like these topics that we're talking about, we could spend an hour or two easily on. It's just that simple. And for a lot of developers out there, like, it's these points we just keep hammering on about. And I think it's very important to have these conversations because so much about the game industry has matured over the last 10, 15 years that if you're trying to design a game or think about game development back in like the early thousands, you're kind of going to be in for a rude awakening.
Right, absolutely. I think one thing that I've seen that kind of interests me is even very successful game designers, I because of sort of the way indie games are, like I now know people they're literally multimillionaires from working in games. They've had every success you can imagine. They've won every award you can imagine. And some of those people struggle still to make a new game because they get very hamstrung by their existing success. And they're like, how can I make something that's the same level, or how can I? And I just think my recommendation always is, I say, make something that will be a commercial failure. Make it that you want to make anything. And make it free. And they go like, why? And no, it will unblock you. If you start thinking about success and comparing yourself to other things and, really early as part of the process, you're not going to make something good. You have to have this weird skill of putting that completely out of your mind and starting to work on something, and then bringing that back in, bring in your knowledge of marketing, like we talked about before, bringing that context into it and going, okay, how can I make this into something that's going to resonate with people, and how much is it for a very niche audience? And that can be fine as well. Especially if you're successful, you don't have to, try and gun for a huge hit. You can go for a little audience, and it's often those things that really do well because there might not be that specific exact thing for someone. So I think working on free projects is really good, even if they're really small, as a way of kind of getting through that block. But also, again, most people get into game design because they want to make things that are fun, that people enjoy, that they can spend time with. And I think refocusing on that rather than all of this secondary stuff, as you said, sort of people who maybe there was that sort of romantic indie game idea that sort of came out. I'm not going to blame Indie Game the movie, because that was a sort of easy target to bash. I think Indie Game the movie is quite interesting in its own right, but there was definitely a sense around that time, around Minecraft as well, where people were like, oh, this is cool in some way, and I can have all this success automatically somehow. And that is, you should just not focus on that. It's not interesting to think about. What's interesting to think about is what can you make that you like that someone else might like.
Yeah, and I've seen what you just described as well, again, with developers who they had that either breakout hit or that massive success, and then they end up struggling to figure out what do they do next. And like what you said, it is very real, that idea of, okay, my last game did this amount, I need to make a game that, can I make something that is equal to that or even better? And it has, again, led to a lot of developers like having that trouble. And for like people like listening to us right now, I think your advice is really sound about just, turn, the marketing off, at the start, and just think about making something that you want to do. Because if you try to just keep one-upping yourself, eventually you're just going to burn out on ideas. And we've had discussions with previous developers about that idea of what does it mean to, be alive or to exist in the game industry long term. And it's something that not as many people are thinking about as they should. One of my favorite guests about this was Jake Burkett of Grey Alien Games.
Oh, Jake's a good friend of mine. Yep. Yeah. He's very good on these topics, and his career has spanned across entirely different areas of games, all the way from casual games kind of back in the day. He did work for Big Fish, and as I'm sure he told you about on the show, and then right through to now that he's working on Ancient Enemy, and we've been talking about that game. And you're so right to think about this. When I started, initially it was sort of, I was applying for jobs out of university, and then working on games seemed more interesting. So that was the only thing I cared about, was, okay, this is more interesting and I might possibly one day make some money from it. Then it became, can we make a good game? And we were just focused so hard on, like, as long as we make a good game, then we'll have done ourselves a service. And then when we went through a period of, how do we follow up? How do we sort of consolidate our position in some ways? And I think some of that thinking, led to some of the things we did which didn't work so well. And then now more recently, just kind of being freed up to do different things again, and exploring things that I perhaps personally like more. It feels exciting again, and it feels like there's a lot more that I can contribute. So your career will go through different phases, up and down phases. It doesn't matter who you are, how successful you are, you're going to have ups and downs. And the thing that helps you ride that out is an underlying love and enjoyment of the process, the people that you're working with, and the medium itself. It's all very well to say that you love games, and sort of everyone enjoys games, but I think if you lose that satisfaction from seeing something emerge from your own mind, and then sort of be realized, or from helping someone else to realize something, that's a kind of underrated thing. Everyone wants to create things, but actually there's such a huge important role for helping facilitate things, which is what I've done for most of my career. If you maintain the love and enjoyment there, then you can't really fail. Even if your career doesn't go commercially the way you want, if you retain that feeling, then you can find a way to build it into your life and find a way to make it work. And that's the most important thing. At the end of the day, it's about trying to, have a life that allows you to incorporate things you love and allows you to work in the way that you want as much as possible. So if you have that as a long-term focus, rather than, I'm going to make an amazing game and be number one on Steam, or, I'm going to win awards and so on, then that will really help keep you going. it stops you comparing yourself to other people as well.
Yep.
That is a nightmare in indie games. I've certainly fallen afoul of that. Everyone does it. Everyone looks at the new game that's released and goes, oh, how many sales did they get in the first week, and this, that, and the other. And that's fun. If it's a light bit of competition and whatever, that's fun. It pushes you forwards, but it's very easy to get bogged down on that. There are so many devs who are like, why did this game sell when my game's like this? You just think sometimes it's luck. It's just pure luck, and sometimes your game just isn't as good as their game, or it's just not as exciting as their game. So don't spend any time on that. Really, there's no nothing productive there. It just makes you feel bad.
And that kind of comparison, like you said, it doesn't really help. Because again, like one of the beauties or one of the nightmares about game development is that you rarely from the outside see all the work that goes into it. And I've said this before about other developers who look at a successful game and think, oh, that person just made a good game and that's all they did. Now they're rich and famous. No, there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes that leads to that success.
Right. And again, like I said, without a real love of the process and a real love of the back and there, you're not going to survive. And also, I think it's okay, if that goes away for a while, if you don't want to work on games. Last year I spent sort of mostly working on music, and that was, it's fantastic to have the opportunity to do that for one thing. I know a lot of people would want that opportunity, but game music is something I've always done alongside games. And there was a time when I thought, I've kind of done what I wanted to do in games, and I'll focus on that now. But then, things come up and opportunities come up, and you think, actually, what, this is going to be the right kind of challenge for me. This is exciting. And you get pulled back in. And I think that's the sign of when you do really love something, you can never really leave it.
So I think with that, again, like, we can just sit here and rant for hours and hours on top, especially with the quarantine going on. I mean, there's no, we don't have to leave the house at some point.
It's the infinite podcast.
Yeah, exactly. But I always offer this. If you're free in the future, Paul, we can always do a follow-up cast, or we can do something live and have questions from the audience as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to do that sometime.
But with that, let's talk a little bit about fights in tight spaces, and then we'll talk. We'll spend probably the rest of our time talking about our topic about long-term retention. Yeah. So, I kind of asked it at the start in terms of kind of introduction, but this time let's talk more about fights in tight spaces. For the people listening to us right now who missed the announcement, what is this game?
Fights in Tight Spaces is a turn-based, card-based fighting game. It's kind of structured like a brawler. So you play a single character fighting a group of enemies in a tight space, as the name would imply. And your moves are cards. So you have a hand of moves dealt to you at the start of a level, and then you have to make the best use of that. So you can do all your standard punches and kicks, but there are also some nice sort of action movie style moves in there, some environmental moves as well. And the whole thing kind of ends up being animated in this sort of cinematic style. The visuals look, I would say, like a tad similar to things like the intro to Casino Royale, James Bond movie. So it's that kind of silhouette look, which looks really cool and enables us to have this kind of stylish action movie feel to everything that's going on. And yeah, there's a big deck building component as well. So you can upgrade different cards. You can kind of shuffle your hand around and make choices about which card you're going to take at different stages and so on. So a really interesting combination of things. Influences include Into the Breach and Slay the Spire. So kind of very trendy influences. Not always the kind of thing that I immediately go for, but it's nice to see a developer who's doing that. Yeah, and it's being developed by Ground Shatter, which is a team in Bristol in the UK. And they made a game called Rico, which is a really excellent sort of blasty, it's kind of a short form FPS. It's largely about kicking doors down and then going to slow motion and shooting everyone in a room as efficiently as possible. Sort of slight Max Payne vibes to that game. I really like that game. I think it's slightly underrated. I mean, it did fairly well, but it's a great game. So go and have a play of Rico on Steam as well. Their previous game. They've got some DLC for that, which I think is out now. So yes, I would check that out as well. But yeah, signed this one last year, hoping to get it out this year. and it's an interesting one. It's one that the James Parker, the lead designer, he's kind of had this idea kicking around for a long time. He's a big action movie fan, and that sort of informs a lot of his game design. So it's really cool to be working with him. He's someone I've known for years as well. So finally getting the chance to do a project together is really fun.
Mm-hmm. And I know from watching like footage of it, it also really reminded me a lot of John Wick Hex that came out last year too. That kind of...
So it's interesting that we've had that comparison a lot, and we knew that the comparison was coming. We kind of were quite far along in design before we knew what Hex was. So when that got announced, it was kind of interesting. I had a funny conversation with Alexander Swinski from Bithell Games where I described Frights in Tight Spaces to him before they'd announced Hex, and he didn't tell me anything about Hex. He just kind of went, that's interesting. and I thought he was reacting to the idea and saying, well, it's a terrible idea. So I said to him, like, oh, do you think that's bad? And he was like, no. And then I saw what they released. So that was pretty funny. Our approach to combat's kind of pretty different from Hex. So Hex has that kind of simultaneous turn-based sort of style. They innovated their own kind of version of that. I think they called it timeline tactics. But Frights is very much definitely traditional turn-based. And one of the reasons for that is James was actually telling me this earlier on a little podcast that we did, but he wanted this idea of, in an action movie, in a close quarters fight, it always looks like the hero has kind of planned out a few moves and they're sort of going bang, 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 and then they take a break. Maybe they respond to someone jumping through a window, or a car crashes into them, or something like that, and then they do another sequence. So he wanted, as you play your hand, he wanted that feeling of like, okay, this move, then this move, then this move, without having necessarily sort of that simultaneous turn-based thing of having to second guess your opponent the whole time. And for me, it was nice having worked on 3 simultaneous turn-based games now to do a pure turn-based game. And there were some real advantages from that, technical advantages as well as gameplay ones.
I think one of my favorite things is, as you were describing the game being Slay the Spire-esque, I just did a podcast with where we were breaking down Slay the Spire, and we were saying how like this game seems to be inspiring all these new deck building style roguelike games. Right. And it's just amazing to kind of see, like, along with something like with John Wick Hex, that idea of, I'm not sure will be the correct term, but it's almost like abstracting like action games into like another genre.
I think it's something that people have wanted for a while, and I think for me personally, I will still play FPSs. I mean, not multiplayer ones, but I think for those games take so much time to build up the skills. Particularly, I think if you're an older gamer or someone who doesn't have that much solid time to put in, it's very hard to dip in and out of Modern Warfare multiplayer. That's something where you need to be practicing kind of every day to be competitive. So I think a lot with action games, this sort of the pause time or slow motion or simultaneous turn-based allows for it to be more of an intellectual kind of decision-making exercise than it is a reflex skill exercise. I think it's that transition from muscle memory and that sort of skill to a more considered kind of chess type of planning gameplay that appeals to people. But I think if you get it framed right, then you can get people who like exciting action to play, and they almost don't sort of think about the fact that it's turn-based that much. It goes back to what you were saying earlier, actually. If the design is seamless enough, people don't notice.
And like for myself, like I grew up playing first-person shooters, so that kind of knowledge is now like secondhand for me.
It's ingrained, yeah.
But I am terrible, like, at the fighting game genre, for instance. Like, I did not, get anywhere good at Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat back in the day. And trying to jump into those genres now, like, it just is like, it's always been that brick wall. And it's kind of like a very interesting parallel to what, like, Smash Brothers did for fighting games, with presenting a very kind of squared down or streamlined take that is been like very appealing to a lot of people.
That I think there's always something to be said, and I would say Overwatch as well for team shooters. People can call it dumbing down. I don't. That's sort of a nasty term for it. Whatever that term is, I love that. I love the chance to be able to go and play a sort of, I guess, maybe a Blizzardified version or just a more accessible version, something that allows me to experience gameplay that otherwise I'd need to, build up this huge skill base just to even play the game. I'm still waiting for someone to do that kind of with RTSs because I did attempt to play StarCraft 2 a lot and managed to get to the point where I could enjoy playing games, but have no hope of ever reaching any kind of reasonably high skill level in that game. So if you can do that as a designer, if you can find a way to synthesize the decisions or the fun from a very high skill based genre, you can actually end up making it have broader appeal. And that's one good way of, if you are trying to design a more commercial type of project, I would say look at something where you can take something that's inherently good, but make it open to a wider audience. That's an amazing thing to do if you can achieve it.
Yeah. And it's, again, this is one of those things that it sounds very easy, but it can be very hard in practice.
Yeah, because you have to retain the inherent good qualities of that thing. And that they might not be able to do that if it...
Yeah. And not only that, but there's also that whole struggle with trying to get out the echo chamber of a genre or your fans. Because as you said, a lot of people look at this as just dumbing down, meaning the game's going to be bad. But you have to really be able to balance, as you said, what is the major appeal of this game, and how do we get this into more hands?
Yeah, it's about changing the dynamics of the game rather than making the game sort of easier. And I think that's what a lot of the more militant kind of hardcore get good style people don't understand is that Overwatch isn't easier. Like if you want to become a top level Overwatch player, you probably need to go and train in Korea. Like it's so that's hard. That is the definition of hard. Something that you have to dedicate your life to doing at a high level. However, it is friendlier and easier for new people to play that than it is, say, Rainbow Six Siege, which is another great game. But it's kind of, I would say that the skill gap from complete beginner to I am having fun participating in a multiplayer game in that game is much wider. And that's fine. Like it's not morally good or bad about either thing. They're just targeted differently. So I think, focusing on understanding that it's a change of curve, like a change of dynamics, which requires a huge amount of design skill to do well. And if you do change that curve, you automatically have a different game. Like Overwatch isn't the same as TF2, and it isn't the same as other team shooters, but it has a feeling that's similar. And that's a real art form. And that's why, they spent so long on that game trying to revise it and tweak it and make it work. And at one point, I remember there were some press previews and it really didn't look like it was going that well. But, being Blizzard, they managed to pull it round to this amazing game. I think it's a great game. And a really interesting thing to study if you're looking at that idea of changing dynamics.
Yep. And like with your example, Rainbow Six Siege, like I tried playing that during a free weekend, I think it was like a month or two ago, and like I was demolished within I think 20 seconds of starting a map, and like I had no idea what was going on. I was like, yeah, this game is not going to be for me. Like the second I saw somebody killed me by prone corner peeking through a wall that was destroyed and got a headshot on me, I was like, yeah, this is above my pay grade. Like, this is not going to work for me.
Right, and you're an FPS player. Though.
Yeah.
Imagine, people who struggle with that. And again, but those games are great as well. So the alternative direction is to make something super, super difficult and super deep, and it requires a massive amount of investment to get good at. I mean, one game that I think about a lot and was talked about at the time, but perhaps not as much as it should have been, was Kenshi. I don't know if you've seen that game.
It sounds familiar, but I don't think I played that.
It's a really interesting game. It's kind of, the best way of describing it is a procedurally generated RPG. So it's kind of a simulated world where you are a character who starts off. I think you always start off as a slave or as a very low character, and there's kind of different tribes and groups and factions in the game who all rove around, and everything is driven by AI and simulation. So it's not like the quests you get aren't kind of written by someone. They're like, this object exists in the world and you need to go and get it. And you can start off as this one character, and then you can build up to kind of being a general, having an army and building a whole settlement. And, it's this enormous scope of game. Quite janky, as a lot of games like that are. And I think it took the developers something absurd like 9 years or 12 years or something to actually get it into a releasable form. But that really shows, it's a very hardcore game. It's very unforgiving, confusing. Like it has elements of Dwarf Fortress and so on, but it's been hugely successful. I mean, an absurd number of sales, and that's because the depth really is there. And if you spend a lot of time on it and you do a lot of reading of wikis and you watch tutorial videos and you figure out the systems for yourself, then you can have experiences in that game that you cannot have elsewhere. And that's sort of the whole trick, really. It doesn't, to be successful, especially on PC. I think PC players are the kind of people often who are willing to explore something. They tend to be curious people who really want to know how things work, and they love systems and picking them apart and trying to get the better of systems often. Think about someone who has a dedicated gaming machine in their house that they may well have built themselves. That's going to be the kind of person who is willing to sit down and give something a lot of time. If you're capable of making a game like that, then you can certainly do very well. But that really that has to be a labor of love. It has to be your life's project. In a lot of cases, look at Dwarf Fortress, the number of years that's been in development. That's someone's life's work right there.
Yes, definitely. And like we said, like, when we get to like those high-end or those like hardcore demanding games, they will undoubtedly create a fan base of hardcore gamers. And then the challenge then becomes, how do we kind of, like, can we soften that for somebody who hasn't been following this game for the last 5 to 10 years? Right. And I know specifically Dwarf Fortress, I know they got picked up. I think they're being published by Kid Fox.
Yes.
And one of the things they're doing for that version is like what I just said. They're trying to make it more appealing to somebody who has no idea what Dwarf Fortress is, and they see it on a Steam store page.
That's a really exciting project, and certainly one that's kind of, what a Herculean task that is, because it's like the ultimate inaccessible game, and sort of, but that's another route that you can go is sort of, once you've built out the scope and depth, then you can start thinking about how do we get people into this. I mean, I played recently the latest Mortal Kombat game, and I'm kind of like you in that I sort of I played a few fighting games. I played Smash for a while, but I'm not a great fighting game player. And the extent of the tutorials in that game now, you can do things like pin moves to the screen, which is brilliant. So you go through the move list, select it, pin it, and then it has all the training mode that tells you your timing and like when it's off and so on. That made me really think, okay, if I wanted to learn this and I had time, I really could, and it would be a much better experience than before, trying to look up frame data and trying, all the frame data and everything is there. So you can start to build on it. And I think that can be a really good approach. So one thing you can do if you make an incredibly complicated game is start thinking about how to tutorialize that later and different ways to get people in. Something that I know EVE Online struggled with massively for years with onboarding, and actually, going back to that game just a few years ago, the onboarding is so much better now, and that there are things that you can start off doing that are quite fun, and it just takes a long time. So really don't kind of, if you have the capability to build something with enormous depth, I think the accessibility can be something that comes later. You got to be careful with that kind of thing, though.
Yep. And that tutorial for MK11, like you said, like, if I had the time to dedicate it, I would probably be spending, every day in that tutorial, just like trying to get good at the game. And it would be amazing to see like more developers kind of take notes about that, because you can't really assume that everyone who plays your game is going to be a hardcore expert.
Exactly. And again, I think it's your in order to make something that has that level of complexity, just giving a nod to new players, I think, is good. But to be honest, a lot of this stuff really does come out of the community, and if you are able to foster that good community around your game, there are so many people online who really love teaching others. If they like something, they want to introduce new people to it. I find that a lot of people who work perhaps in the tech industry, or maybe are programmers or sysadmins or work on that sort of thing, they can be some of the most considerate people at getting new people into something they like. I mean, I think people get a lot of bad press for being kind of angry nerds and stuff like that, gatekeeping, and obviously that goes on as well. But I found that a lot of people really, if they love something, they're just kind of happy that someone else is interested in it, and they want to help them as much as possible. So those are the people to promote in your community, especially if you have a systems-driven game, like maybe people who work with systems for their jobs and are used to articulating them to others is the kind of person I'm trying to define here. But I've had so many people from that kind of area of life and that kind of area of work get involved, particularly with our games, and then become really productive, helpful community members. So if you can facilitate them, they're going to be the people that help the new players get into your thing.
Yep. And going back to Frights for a second, I think this will also be a good kind of lead in to our final topic, at least for today. What kind of, I guess, persistent elements, or like what kind of replayability do you see with the game?
Something that we're working on actively at the moment is getting the metagame kind of there, the wider scope of the game. There are various different paths that we might go down for that. So it could include everything from, choices you make in one playthrough affecting things in another, or, different availability of different cards and so on. But that's all very much up in the air, and it's not something I'd want to kind of discuss without having made decisions on, because I know that can be quite difficult for people who are following a game. They will pick on any detail and kind of go like, when is this thing happening? And then you kind of put yourself into a corner. So that's something that James, the designer, is really actively thinking about. We had a discussion about that today earlier, what direction we go in with that. Again, we're focusing a lot now on making sure that core is really good. We've got some plans for how we're going to test that. To give my one plug of the episode, if you do want to find our Discord and go and join that, that'll be the way that you get to play the game before anyone else. So we'll be doing some testing in the community and really making sure that we get that really good core there first before we kind of expand out into the secondary metagame stuff. So sorry, I can't kind of go into massive details on that yet, but it's all a work in progress.
Great. And do you have any timetables for like going into early access, or when more people can get a chance to try it out?
Not currently that we're announcing. I mean, we've said that the game will be out this year. We haven't ruled out early access. I think probably unlikely that we'll do that. I think we'll go for a full launch, but we'll see how things go. A lot will depend on the next few months and how people are reacting to what we have already and how everything gets built out. So yeah, we're sticking to this year for now.
All right, great. So with that, let's get to what will be kind of like our design topic then for this cast. We'll see how long this one will go. But let's talk, as you said, about this idea of long-term retention for games. Because this is something that can definitely be hard for a lot of developers. Because I've played games myself where the game boasts, 50, 100 hours of gameplay, hundreds and thousands of puzzles or stages, and I get bored or I just feel like I'm done with this game after about 20 minutes of play. And I know this is something that you've been thinking about quite regularly.
Right. Retention is one of those things where it's about the variation of the challenge, the persistence of the challenge, how much you're using skills that you've built up along the way. We've touched on this already with multiplayer and sort of action games. And then it's about the systems that you're interacting with and how much potential there is there. And one big element, I think, in this is player creativity. If your game it's kind of one of the reasons we've seen, games like Minecraft do so well is that there's a kind of a blank canvas there. I think a lot of retention is to do with the potential of the player to create things in one category. In another category, you have things like Destiny, which are about gating off content for people who are willing to invest an absurd amount of time. So you're actually saying it's a kind of transactional relationship with the player where you're saying, okay, if you spend this amount of time doing these things, you can have power that no other players can have, and do things, do missions and raids and so on that no other players can get to. So that's a different kind of retention where it's sort of this promise of a reward at the end of a really long path. The path has to consist of gameplay that you like, but I mean, in Destiny, the actual things you're doing don't really change for the whole game. You're shooting stuff in different parts of its body. You're upgrading the guns. You're modding them. You're combining different abilities and different things together. That's what you do for the whole time. And if you love that more than anything else in the world, you just want new variations of that to kind of come on. And then finally, I think there's a community aspect as well. There's a sociable aspect, and that's been one of the big success points with Fortnite. You've seen a lot of particularly younger players. They don't play Fortnite. They use it as a system to hang out with their friends, and like that's a huge part of that game. So there are all these different types of retention, but they ultimately boil down to someone really plausibly having a long-term relationship with making. There are a lot of developers who'll make something and they'll say like, oh, this is cool, and people will keep playing it because it's fun. And you think, well, yeah, but is it going to be fun for 100 hours?
Yes.
It's difficult. It's very difficult for something to be fun for 100 hours because it has to contain elements of novelty, or it has to contain other relational things that cause people to sort of stick there. I think we're starting to see a real maturation of retention. It was a term that originally merged with free to play, and it often kind of meant trapping people in sort of Skinner box type scenarios, or just that you can think of like a stereotypical clicker. But there are all sorts of ways that you can generate long-term retention, even using some of those mechanics. I mean, I think everyone got into Universal Paperclips. I don't know if you played that game.
Yes, I did.
Right. So yeah, but that was a way of showing like how you can even have a satirical element to what you're doing and have it be effective. So it's not those mechanics that are bad in some way or immoral or wrong. It's more kind of how you use it and how you treat the player that you're in that long-term relationship with. You can treat them badly, you can exploit them, or you can celebrate them, reward them, and take care of them. And I prefer obviously games that do the latter, but people will always make games that do the former as well.
And like we were having our discussion about with Fights in Tight Spaces, and just like Slay the Spire as well, that kind of ability to retain a player through the gameplay itself can come in all shapes and sizes. You mentioned titles like Fortnite, Destiny, and mobile games. A lot of them, of course, are built around this idea of continued content and continued support, so that when a player gets to the end, there's always new content coming or new content being developed. Yeah. But we also see, again, like from the roguelike aspect of being able to design, and this goes back to what we said in like kind of our first part of this cast, with getting a core gameplay loop that kind of affords or allows for that level of variance that somebody can keep coming back and having new experiences.
Right.
This is why, like, one of my design books I want to write is going to focus on roguelike gameplay and that roguelike design. Because it's, again, one of those things where once you understand it, you can kind of tweak your game or tweak your design to accommodate for more of that replayability, so that it does feel not so much like a completely new game, but that you can have different experiences within that same core gameplay loop.
Right, that's absolutely critical. Whenever sort of people talk about roguelikes or roguelites, I think about games like Spelunky and games like Binding of Isaac, which are just about, they both use these very simple traditional gameplay paradigms so that the base gameplay is there before you've even started on that stuff. So Spelunky is a platformer, and Binding of Isaac is a twin stick shooter. And those are such refined genres, the arcade versions of those genres. I mean, there's so many platformers in the world. It might be still one of the most sort of popular genres of games. But if you have a structure there that is solid to start with, then you can build other stuff around it and on top of it that informs it. It's what we tried to do with Frozen Synapse too. You know, we took that core gameplay from Frozen Synapse and then built a whole simulation around it. And I felt that part was really successful. One of the things that worked best about that game was having that solid gameplay there first, and then other things that modulate and affect it. And it just so happens that both of those games kind of had the scope and had the depth to them to take off, and then others haven't maybe had that, because I think people look at that structure and they kind of think that it's easy. Again, they think, oh, it's just a twin stick shooter and then some weird stuff happens. That's cool or whatever. But the devil's in the detail with that kind of game. I mean, they're so time consuming to develop well. And there's so many things that can go wrong. I mean, Isaac particularly is a game that barely holds together, even in all of its current forms. It feels like it's about to do something that's going to cause it to crash almost constantly, because of the absolute absurdity of things that can happen. Stuff can be scaled to different sizes. Yes. There can be infinite numbers of one thing on the screen. There can be all these effects happening simultaneously. And that route to sort of long-term depth and retention, I think, is a hard and rocky one, but amazing for anyone that has the persistence to travel it.
And again, like, that level of insanity with the scale, I wrote about that in my first book when I was looking at major games people need to know more about. I also did Spelunky in that book as well. And again, it's that element that things aren't always going to happen the same way. And I think this is one of like the hard points of this kind of retention, is that the replay value of something like The Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, etc. is different than, say, the replay value of an RPG. Or right now, like as we're recording this, the big game that's out is Doom Eternal. Right. I'm sure, like, and again, like, I haven't played Doom Eternal right now. I'm, like, sitting on the fence as to whether or not to buy it. But I played all the way through Doom 2016. And, like, on one side, the core gameplay loop of Doom 2016 was, I think, as perfect as one could get for that kind of FPS.
Yep.
But in the same breath, I did start to, like, feel kind of like it dragging on. And that is, I think, one of those things that it's kind of hard to describe. Similar, again, to how easy it is to make a core gameplay loop. So, I guess, to throw this over to you, like, when do you feel like even, like, a great game, even something that you're enjoying, that it just starts to feel like, ugh, I gotta keep playing this, or, there's still 10 more hours of stages to do, or things like that?
There's a couple of problems there. I think one of them is just the natural attrition of doing the same thing all the time. Like, it's fun to eat a chocolate cake, but you don't want to eat chocolate cake every day.
Yes.
Not least because it's terrible for you. But if you take that out of the equation, it's sort of like that makes it less special. You know what's going to happen. But whereas if you spread it out a bit, you have different meals, and then you have a different flavor of chocolate cake, then you get excited about it again and you like it. So that's very trivial, very basic, but it's something that people can forget. Another is progression mechanics within games, and this is incredibly difficult. Yes. There are some types of gameplay where you can't really do all that much progression. Like, you can make it harder, you can make it easier, you can have different layouts and different numbers of bad guys and enemy composition or what have you. But actually, and I'm thinking back to like maybe the original Doom here or some of the build engine games. It's kind of, they were so rinsed out in terms of that gameplay that the only things you could really end up doing was sort of novelty stuff. That's why you got kind of weird bosses in like games like Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior, and weird underwater levels or crazy, they just try and throw in variation that way, but actually the gameplay doesn't sort of progress that much. You don't, in Duke Nukem, you don't sort of start having multiple dukes that you manage that are on a roster and they get injured, and there's no meta game to Duke Nukem 3D. With Doom, because these modern games refocus the gameplay around that very tight sort of action-based loop, and I think there's some argument to be made in Doom 2016 that perhaps some of the weapon balancing wasn't fantastic. I know I've seen sort of some people who are really into those games talk about that. That kind of thing can really kill the late game. But then, I think some of this might be rose-tinted goggles, because the late game of a lot of those classic games is not good.
Yes.
And that's just a function of kind of all the things we've talked about, where needing to escalate, needing, this feeling that you need to increase difficulty towards the end of the game, which you don't, actually. It doesn't have to get harder. It just feels like it should. All of that together, I think, can make it really different. So you can't have both. You can't have a game that's kind of harking back to like those classic, very tight gameplay loops, and something that can perfectly progress in this beautiful arc. I think sometimes games need to be a little bit more complicated to have that type of progression. You have to pick your battles, and I think Doom 2016 was pretty successful in providing a lot of gameplay like that was really good and had the right balance of things. But it's about knowing sort of where your bread and butter gameplay is, and making sure there's enough of that rather than weird stuff to make it seem like it's coming to a conclusion.
And like you said, like for a lot of classic games, as somebody who I've been playing a lot more classic games like every week on the channel that I do, like they get very annoying at some of the end of these games, because as you said, like a lot of developers will think that progression just means difficulty. We're just going to bump everything up by like 50 on the final level, and that's great design. But being able to present different challenges and different ways of doing something usually ends up giving the player kind of, I guess, I wouldn't say a reprieve, but kind of like a mini vacation that allows them to see something new.
Right.
A really great example of this would be stuff like the old school Mario games and all the different ways that you can apply these mechanics and do something different with them. And I was just playing another game lately, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it was called a Wonderling or something like that. It's kind of like a puzzle platformer, endless runner kind of thing. And very simple mechanics, but by changing things up each level or by presenting new things, it makes it so that it doesn't feel like I'm just doing the same thing for 2 to 5 hours. I'm getting like these, like essentially like bursts of different gameplay loops.
That's amazing if you have a structure that can do that. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Mario, because those games really have that kind of down to a T, where the level design kind of tool set is there, and then it's about whatever anyone could do with it. I mean, obviously that's why Mario Maker works. It's kind of, it's a creative medium in itself, really, and that's an amazing design goal to have. I think if you can hit that, certainly in a more linear type of game, but this is kind of where systems-driven games come in. I mean, sandbox simulation and city builders and so on have become really all the rage, and that's because they have a very natural built-in capability to retain players. You can play the same level of a city builder game forever if you like that level. You can find different ways of doing it, different build orders, different ways of organizing the space. And that's really the power of any type of simulation in a game, is that it creates that natural possibility space that's wider than it is in a linear game.
And like we said, it's that kind of difference in design compared to something that's meant to be replayable. I guess here's a question for you. Like, for myself, I do sometimes go back and play like very linear games, such as action titles, Souls-like, stuff like that. After enough time has passed, that it's not as fresh in my mind. Do you do that with some of these kinds of games?
Yeah, I've gone back to things, definitely. I mean, I replayed all of Doom 1 recently and some of Doom 2, and that was really good to do, because there are levels and things that are familiar, but you always notice new things in games like that. I mean, we've seen the popularity of services like, GOG and the classic mini consoles and so on, where it doesn't matter how old something is or how linear it is. I mean, a game that I love playing through is Streets of Rage 2. I just love the aesthetics of that game, and also the feel of it. There are so many side-scrolling beat 'em ups. Have a friend and we've been trying to play through different side-scrollers kind of whenever we can meet up. And we've played some really bad ones and some really weird ones, but there's nothing quite like the combination of how the characters move and how they feel in how the control feels in Streets of Rage 2 with the feedback of the incredible visuals and sound. And even though I know every single screen of that game and kind of I could probably list out all the enemies as they appear, it's sort of I'm never going to get tired of playing through that. So it's like a piece of music, really. I mean, music is a linear form, and if you listen to the same piece of music over and over and over again every day, you'll probably get sick of it. But then, you might come back to it a few years down the line.
Mm-hmm. So I guess with more about replayability, or I think more focusing on long-term retention. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of examples of games that I've played that from a core gameplay loop standpoint, they work. But no matter how much you try to change things up, or kind of put twist on the existing gameplay, it kind of feels like let's say we were we could measure the core gameplay loop as maybe only having an hour or two of entertainment. And I think that's another very interesting thing, a very hard thing to try and nail down for games. When you're trying to sit to yourself, and again, this goes back to some of our previous conversations today, that idea of, okay, what's my core gameplay loop? And how much can I reasonably expect to get out of this?
Right. And different types of games suit different, expectations there as well. And, again, you might set out to make one kind of thing and then end up making another. And there's nothing wrong with short games. There are sort of a lot of games out there that don't have these mega playtimes. I would say that I think it's immeasurably harder to have a very large-scale commercial success with a short game than it is with a longer game, and there's a couple of just sort of necessarily true logical reasons for that. One being that if every person who's playing your game plays it for longer, then there's more opportunity for them to be talking about it, sharing it with other people. It will show up in their Steam and Discord statuses for longer. They will want to consume more content about it. They'll, there's sort of natural things that happen when someone plays a game for longer. And that does favor, those simulation-y type games, just because of the sort of ecosystems that we're in. But you don't, not everything has to be about that. Not everything has to be about sort of how many copies can you sell and whatever. So there's plenty of very, very interesting short games that, can really work or can say something different. So I would say to designers, although there's always going to be a talk about retention and the benefits of that, and it's certainly something that I look for on the more commercial side of things, there's plenty of opportunity to make cool short things.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another conversation we've been having lately. And earlier you mentioned, of course, when Steam Greenlight came about, or Steam Direct, and how a lot of people are saying doom and gloom along those lines. There's definitely been this discussion about whether or not short games are still viable. Because as I'm sure you're well aware of, and I'm sure as the audience listening is, we are seeing, at least in the digital era, a lot more in terms of refund policies. And again, you buy a game, and Steam's basic idea is that you can return it within 14 days with under 2 hours played, no questions asked. You can even go a little bit further than that. Again, we don't know the exact metrics, so Steam is very private about that. But there have been discussions about, is it still commercially viable to make a game that is only an hour long or 30 minutes long?
I think it's commercially viable to do anything. If you're doing something that is massively appealing and unique. You know, if you made an hour-long game that was just the most incredible narrative experience, if you made a sort of Edith Finch or an Everybody's Gone to the Rapture or, you know, a Firewatch that was an hour long, then I think people would buy it. But it would have to be so amazing in that 1 hour because you'd have all those disadvantages that you know, versus stuff that I just mentioned. And you made a very good point with refunds. I don't believe that has kind of killed off that kind of genre of game, particularly because I think if maybe it has for a more a sort of more disinterested audience who are kind of quickly picking it up in a sale or whatever, and they're playing it and they didn't like it. But so it might, you know, maybe there are some games that you could point to that wouldn't work now because of that. But I kind of think this is just pure speculation now. I kind of think that's a bit overrated as a threat. And I think the people who have issues with refunds, you know, maybe there's some other factors there. Again, I'm sure you could find examples where that's not true. And I'm not trying to say that no one's ever had a problem with refunds or anything like that. I'm really sort of speculating off the top of my head here, but I'm still intrigued by that. I mean, there's so many different aspects to which games are doing well and when. I mean, I've talked about a few sort of walking simulator style games, and one that I always come back to is the Beginner's Guide, which was one of those games that was sort of, it caused a bit of a buzz at the time, and then kind of got forgotten about. But to me, is sort of one of the most interesting first-person game experiences that exists, and that, you know, ostensibly did extremely well on Steam, despite being a short, linear narrative experience that you probably don't really want to play more than once. So I think even though that came out a while ago, if someone made a new Beginner's Guide style game now that had the same level of weight to it and the same level of thought put into it, I would absolutely play it, and I think a lot of people would as well.
Yeah. And like you said, with the amount of quality that can go into these titles, it's always like, and I've said this before, like for myself, I'd rather play a game that is amazing, but could only be maybe a few hours long, versus something that it feels like it's either being padded out or the gameplay just isn't there, but it has supposedly 500, 1,000 hours you can go into it.
Right. And I think most people would as well. I think one problem is that people tend to enjoy the feeling of there being a lot to something, like the feeling of it being substantial and there being lots of things that they haven't seen yet or could potentially see in the future. So I think one of the reasons that you get stuff that is a bit more padded out is that need to create that feeling of making something that feels weightier, and whether that's, you know, good or bad or right or wrong, it is a real psychological factor for players. So I think it's difficult to get away from that. And the other factor is, you know, while some things feel padded out, the sad truth is if you have a long linear game, 90% of players are not going to see the last third of it. So it's just natural for developers to spend much more energy on the start and middle of those games, because basically games always, you know, there's never enough time to make a game. It doesn't matter if you're on a self-imposed schedule, or there's just never enough time. So your energy has to go somewhere, and in linear games it tends to go towards the start and middle. There are some good exceptions to that. You know, the original Prey is really interesting on that regard, where it suddenly kicks into a crazy weird gear at the end and starts doing all sorts of interesting things. I won't spoil that game for people, even though it's really old. I don't think enough people have played it. But the ending levels of that game, if you can press through some of the terrible stuff in the middle, are really extraordinary and wacky and creative. So there are certain games, like that's just a random example that came to mind, where there's a huge amount of creativity in the late game of a linear progression. So yeah, some exceptions to the rule.
And I want to touch on the idea of the idle genre, that kind of idle progression curve, because that I think is another very fascinating aspect when it comes to retention. Because Since you brought up Universal Paperclips, I'm sure you are well aware of the idle genre as much as I am in terms of how addictive these games can be. And these are not titles designed around massively complicated games or, long-term gameplay loops. But it's about that kind of, I guess, that escalation or that progression in scale that keeps somebody coming back for more.
Right. Universal Paperclips is interesting because it genuinely has these very different phases to it. And again, that's sort of almost a spoiler. If you haven't played that game, just go and play that. And the only advice you need is stick with it and follow that advice to the bitter end. But yeah, that sense of escalating scale, I think, is important. That sense of, how far you've come in a clicker game, even though it's all very nakedly just sort of numerical trickery. It does something to your brain to kind of, I think it's just like the living embodiment of sunk cost fallacy, where you're kind of there going, I've put so much into this, so much of my life has gone into this game. If I just keep going a little further, I'll get somewhere really important. It's an interesting phenomenon. I feel like a lot of those mobile games kind of very directly play with human psychology in a sort of very one-to-one type of way, whereas other stuff might be a little less crude in the way that it does that, maybe a little more subtle. But clickers are interesting. I mean, like anything, it's a gameplay structure. I think a lot of mobile experimented with how little interactivity can we have and how little skill or little decision making can we have, and that's actually a very interesting design exercise. If you take kind of, I think morality tends to get brought into the picture because of the way that a lot of those games monetize. And there's real questions about that.
Yes.
What type of, are they preying on people who are vulnerable? Are they playing on things like gambling addiction or certain types of personality that will get fixated on particular things and may not have the best self-control when it comes to money? Like, those are real moral issues, and luckily I think we've seen a much better discussion and framing of those as time has gone on. But if you take that out of it, so let's say it's a free game that it doesn't monetize, I don't think there is sort of an innate morality there or an innate moral problem. I actually just think it's kind of an interesting design tool that you can use to do different things, good or bad, just like any other set of mechanics, really.
Yep. And saying about mobile, like, I've had a chance to play like several big name mobile games over the past few months. I've been playing Marvel Strike Force, and I recently downloaded, I think it's Marvel Contest of Champions, and both games, I think, occupy what you just described, that it is a game that's built on that kind of grinding or that kind of like very small, very simple core gameplay loop, and then just keeps expanding out with kind of, okay, you've gotten this character to 3 stars. Now you should try to get them to 4 stars, or maybe you'll get a lucky pool this time, and so on and so forth. And it's something that we've talked about on many podcasts before, that these kinds of designs, they weren't designed because the developer was stupid or they didn't want to make something complicated. They were designed that way because it works. That kind of that sense of scale, that idea that there's always another form of power or another thing that I can do, is a very powerful motivator to keep somebody playing. And
right, absolutely, yeah. It's just a lever,
yes,
in the human brain. Yep.
And I think that takes me to a question that I wanted to ask, because it's a conversation we've had before with other developers. Is the idea or the concept of grinding in a game, is that, like, can that be, I guess, weighed as being good or bad? Because there are some people who feel that the second the game becomes a grind, it is automatically bad. But then there's this concept, or there's this discussion I've had with people about that you can have good grinding with a title.
It's just personal taste. If you like, I mean, I mentioned Destiny earlier. Like, I've enjoyed playing Destiny, maybe sort of 10 or 12 hours of Destiny 2, and kind of gone, I kind of get what this is doing. Like, that's interesting, and it's not for me to have a long-term thing with it. Whereas other people, they just love they love shooting the same enemy over and over again. It's kind of relaxing or calming for them, or
Yeah.
it's a place that they can go and they feel safe, and it's predictable and repetitive. A lot of I think something that you learn a lot perhaps when you grow up is that entertainment isn't always about being challenging and exciting. It can be about giving you a safe place to be mentally, especially if your life is challenging. Like I mentioned offhand, sort of when I was talking about the history of Mode 7, we spent some time working on TV quiz shows, and part of that was doing graphics operating. So one of us would go into the studio when they were filming the show and operate the the scores or the question system or whatever. And when you work on that stuff a lot, that's sort of in some ways the lowest common denominator of all entertainment is a TV quiz show, because it's just nothing. It's a quiz. It's very light. There's nothing challenging about it particularly. And I remember kind of thinking, coming out of one of these things and going, it's a bit depressing making this stuff. And then I had a conversation with my grandmother, and it turned out that she loved to watch one of the shows that we happened to be working on. And she was so excited that I was working on it, and it just connected with her in a way that sort of none of my work ever had really before. She said, "Oh, you work on that? Oh, it's so good," And the reason that she watched that was it just provided some structure and routine in her day. It was a distraction, and it wasn't sort of difficult. Now, obviously, it's not good for people to just only sort of see unchallenging things in there and never kind of experience anything that challenges their worldview. But there's such a huge need for entertainment like that. It's really a kind of a thing that can be very good for your mental health, and also it's always good to just take things down a notch at times. So games that do that, grinding is a big part of that for a lot of people, particularly MMO style gameplay. If they can do it with friends around, so they're, grinding something, or they'll be on chat with a couple of people talking about something else, or they just feel like they're gently building towards a goal and they don't have to occupy all of their brain, that's great. Let people enjoy that. I know it's a frustrating type of gameplay for people, but I think as long as it's clear that that's kind of what you're in for, or there's a way to skip it and get round it if someone's trying to play the game in a different way, then let people enjoy that if they want to enjoy it.
Yeah. And again, it's that same kind of mentality with the idle genre for me, or even if I play, like you mentioned Streets of Rage 2 earlier. I play that one, Contra, the old school games where I've gotten so good at it, I can just kind of relax and play those games. Like, it's not stressful for me at all to sit back and enjoy them.
I'm impressed that Contra is not stressful for you. I find it very stressful. Yeah, right, exactly. It's the same thing about that stuff. They will often have something that they personally kind of use for that same thing. It just happens to be a different game or movie or TV show. So again, I think it's about balance, like, and a lot of life is about balance. Like, having some things like that in your life are really good. I was someone for years where I wouldn't really use entertainment to relax that much. I was always quite analytical about it, and sort of I'd want to sort of see what I could extract from it that might be useful for work, or kind of look at what the writer was doing in a TV show or whatever. But finding something where I can just relax and enjoy it. Maybe it's something that's really silly, or I used to watch a lot of bad movies when I was at college. Like I would go and buy cheap movies from discount stores and just watch like the worst thing you could ever imagine. I found that relaxing because everything about it was so incompetent that you were kind of enjoying that more than you were the actual movie. There was nothing remotely challenging about it other than trying to figure out why someone would ever make something so weird. That kind of thing I think is really healthy. And again, it's a lot of this stuff I think comes from defensive-ness and judgment of other people and their lives. And actually, if you kind of look at your own life, your own situation, there's probably a lot of things where you're doing the same type of stuff to relax or what have you. So again, it just comes back to let other people enjoy things, but developers also make sure that your contract with a player is fair. If you're presenting them with all this exciting stuff and then suddenly throwing grinding at them and saying, aha, you can't have it, just arbitrarily, that's always going to be annoying to people. So as long as that conversation is clear with the player and, you're not trying to hide the type of game that you're really making, then I don't think that anyone can have a problem with it, really.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think with that, we're closing in on 2 hours of this conversation. I think we can begin to wrap things up because, again, a lot of these conversations can easily turn to long form discussion. So I guess anything else regarding retention or long form gameplay that you'd like to bring up?
I think I kind of want to again clarify for designers, at the moment, the thing to do if you're trying to make a game that's commercially successful is to think about retention. Trying to make a game that's commercially successful, it shouldn't be the be all and end all. If you have an original different idea that you want to go for that doesn't display these obvious retention traits, then you go and make that thing. You might be onto some new genre or some new idea that's going to blow everything else out of the water anyway. And also, it's so important, and it's so important for culture and for indie games as a whole, that people don't solely focus on commercial goals. As long as they're aware that that's what they're doing, and then they don't have huge expectations of it, go out and make whatever it is that you want to make, and see if it connects with people. And I promise that, you will surprise yourself, and you will find new areas of your kind of creativity as a game developer that you may not have discovered before. So there's so much value in all the different types of game development, that it's the conversation shouldn't be dominated by commerce, but also, it's useful to pay attention to such things if you're trying to run a game development business. So yeah, game development should be a broad church with lots of different approaches. That's one of the things that makes it cool and interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think that is a great sentiment to end on in terms of just trying to be able to look at these games and see, what they're trying to achieve. And again, not every game can or should be designed around dozens or hundreds of hours of gameplay. And if you're able to, again, going back to kind of our central theme with the core gameplay loop, if you're able to make something enjoyable for 30 minutes, an hour, then see what you can do with that. And it's perfectly okay to say that this game is meant for 3 hours of gameplay. There shouldn't be anything wrong with having a short experience, just as there shouldn't be anything wrong with having something being long.
Exactly.
All right, so I think with that, we will wrap things up for this week's cast. Paul, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you while we are still stuck inside. We'll see. Maybe by the time this cast goes live, we'll be able to leave our homes. We should, hopefully, at least.
Oh, I hope so. And yeah, just shout out to everyone listening. Keep going at the current time, and everyone will get through it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything you would like to say to the fans, or anything to wrap up the cast with?
Just nothing other than to thank you, and it's a great sort of experience and a nice break to be able to talk game design with you in this sort of long form format. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope I'll be back sometime.
No problem. Thanks again for coming on. Like I said, we've been trying to get things going, through email and Twitter tag, but it's great to finally be able to sit down. And if you are free in the future, we can always do a follow-up cast or do something live.
That'd be great. Look forward to it.
All right. Before I let you go, do you have any social media? I know you plugged a few things earlier. Anything else you would like to plug for people to follow you or find you?
Sure. Just Mode 7 Games on Twitter and 7 Games. And if you would like to really help us out, then go and check out Frights in Tight Spaces on Steam and give it a wish list if it looks interesting.
Great. You kind of cut out for a split second after you said your Twitter. What was the second thing that you said?
So I'll just say that again. So my Twitter is Mode 7 Games, MOD number 7 Games. And if you would like to check out Frights in Tight Spaces on Steam, please do so and give it a wish list.
All right, great. So, with that, for those of you listening, we're going to end things for this week's cast. If you'd like to follow me, I am on Twitter at GWBicer. There's, of course, our Patreon as well, patreon.com/GWBicer. Your donations can help to keep things running and get access to stuff such as ad-free versions of our videos and thank yous for a lot of our stuff. But you can follow... you can also join our Discord channel. There should be a link to that down below. It is open to everyone at the basic tier. And we'll be back next week for another discussion on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And be sure to check back for daily discussions as well. But that's going to do it for now. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Perceptive Podcast. Have a great rest of your night, and we will talk again real soon. Again real soon. Again real soon. Again real soon. Again real soon.